Yes, so I'm a student at Leeds Beckett University, currently doing a master's in town regional planning. And one of our modules, we had the opportunity to look at visioning of the future. And one that particularly took my eye was gender equal cities, and especially the focus on how women interact with the city, how they're able to use it, and how they feel they're able to use it. So I think it's first important to just understand what we mean by gender. So, while sex refers to the biological categories of male and female, gender, as defined by the World Health Organization, refers to the characteristics of women, men, girls, and boys that are socially constructed. And this can refer to social, behavioural, and cultural expectations and norms associated with being male or female. And it's important to note that how an individual experiences gender may or may not correspond to the sex they're assigned with at birth or how others perceive them. And there's also no uniform gender category, and different women and men will experience life differently to other women and men. And when we talk about cities, we're talking about these urban spaces that are physical places, infrastructure, buildings, parks, and squares. And gender can really define how we perceive the city and how we perceive that we can interact with it. And it must be acknowledged as well that gender is not the only thing that can sway that. It can also be age, sex, social class, ethnic identity, everything else. But gender is what I'll talk about a bit today. And it's important to consider it because by 2050, 68% of the world's global population will live in cities, and about half of this population will be women. And while this can be emancipating for some women, offering jobs and opportunities, it can also reflect on equal power relations. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 1 and 13, obviously note everyone's entitlement to freedom and equality. Yeah, I'm sure we're all aware of these sort of news articles that I've listed on the right-hand side here that show that women don't necessarily have that same equality of access to public space and can quite often be unsafe in their surroundings. So, to give a brief whistle-stop tour of a feminist critique of the history of planning, they note that since the inception of modern planning in sort of the late 19th century, it's been a male-dominated profession, and unequal power relations have arisen because of this. Despite comprising about 40 to 50% of graduates from urban planning and design, women make up only about 10% of the highest ranking jobs at leading architecture firms and urban planning offices. And a feminist critique sort of notes that because these women aren't included in the planning process or the design of cities, their views and experiences have often been omitted, and this meant that cities have been designed and planned by men who haven't necessarily catered for those other characteristics of other genders. And this is sort of work to compound those differences, and people who don't perhaps fit that male norm don't necessarily feel as they can use the city as well. So some contemporary urban implications have been on zoning, transport, and safety. And zoning has sort of arisen by a logic of monoland use, and it separated the city into functions such as residential zones, industrial, commercial, institutional. And while this sort of worked to inscribe order, it also compounded those assumed gender roles. So the public sphere sort of included the productive out of the house work, which was typically the role of the male, while the private sphere was sort of for the women, designed for, however, not designed with women. And this could enable them to carry out their homework in the house. But increasingly, women are becoming employed and into the productive work sphere. But a study found that about 75% of women still do the world's unpaid care work. But zoning often means that the zones that they need to visit, such as from the home to the institutions, to the schools, to the care for the elderly, are located quite far away. And this often places a playoff between their demands as they need to travel between those different zones. And transport kind of compounds this as well, in that it often caters for commuters going from the residential zone to the work zone. Whereas women, as we sort of spoke about before, often need to trip chain and reach those different zones to carry out their jobs. And it also works in terms of transport. You don't often find a bus that will let you pay for to travel the whole city. It's often from point A to point B. And this can sort of compound those challenges a little bit. And safety is a further issue that's arisen from this. So quite often between these different zones, sort of no man's lands have been created, which are often badly lit, or there's less natural surveillance in the way of people. And this can inspire feelings of unsafety. And while this may not stem directly from personal experiences, it's that perception of fear that can really influence a woman's behaviour and how they feel that they can interact with the city. So some concepts of feminist utopia try to tackle this a little bit, and I won't go into each of these three, but they span hundreds of years, so from 1405 to 1986, and this is by no means all of them. One thing they do share, each of these three, is their idea of feminist utopia is a walled city away from men, and while that isn't really necessary or what we could perhaps logically do at this point, I think it's quite an interesting point just to raise. Some more modernist critiques include Jacobs and Kerr, and Jacobs rejected the practice of zoning and instead advocated for the idea of a mixed use area, and it's the vitality of the mixed uses in a city which encourages people to use the space to walk, and this raises the concept of eyes on the street, which increases that perception of safety, and in doing so increases people's perception of being able to become involved and to use the city. And more recently, Kern's feminist city has a lens through motherhood. So she uses her own experience of being a mother and sort of draws out this inequality. And it also stems from the public transport system. And she advocates for a city built upon care, not only just for women, but to enable the care to be shared out. And quite interestingly, both Jacob and Kerr note that it's that representation. If you have a higher level of representation, you can build a city for everyone. So I'm aware of time, so I apologise. I'll try and fly through the rest. Umea, I think, is a really interesting example of how they've aspired to redesign the urban environment to promote gender equality. And the Lev passage in particular was built in response to a series of sexual assaults, unfortunately, on women in the area. And it created a long passage that connected sort of the city centre to the Haga district. And they implemented large rounded corners, lots of light and large entrances to increase that feeling of safety, increase the feeling of eyes on the street and people being able to see one another. And they didn't just create this for women, but it was so that everybody could be involved. The paths are sloped wherever possible, to really increase that accessibility as well. Vienna is often heralded as sort of an exemplar in gender equal design, and they've had a number of pilot projects since the late 1900s, including street lighting and widening pavements. And they also, in Einsiedler Park, noted that girls were using the park a lot less than boys after the age of 9. And to combat this, they've worked with those people and found that they needed sort of more entrances, more spaces that could be used for different things. So in the top corner, you can see sort of a platform, and this is seating, but it's a stage, and it's something to jump off and do gymnastics on and really engage with. And Malmo as well, they were creating different activity spots within the city, but found that they weren't often used by women. And so they worked particularly with women and girls aged from 16 to 24 to design this new activity space. And they've created this space that's full of different uses. And again, it's these different platforms that can be used for different things. They break the park up into smaller spaces, so not one sort of sport or activity can dominate. And what's really nice about this is the group actually stayed together and continued to lobby in the city for more gender equal design. And finally, a bit more of a local one in Leeds, they've created separated cycle and walking routes, again, to improve this feeling of safety. It's separated from the road, it's appealing, and this can really encourage people to walk and engage greater with their local environment. So that's all from me. Thank you so much for listening, and apologies for going over time.
Don't worry. Thank you, Sarah. That was really interesting and really highlighted the point of how complex it is to kind of design our streets and spaces. And often at the UDG, we kind of say that if we would design all our streets and spaces for 12-year-old children, then potentially they could be safe for everyone. And I mean, it would be interesting to hear if you kind of agree with that statement, because obviously we need to consider the elderly, different genders, children, different abilities. So it's highly complex.